The Filioque Clause has been a point of contention for over 1500 years. Last time we heard a little bit of the history. Reminder is that the word Filioque means "and the Son," and it was inserted into the Nicene Creed by the Western Church, the Latin-speaking church, way after the Nicene Creed was agreed upon. So the difference was that the Eastern Church said that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. The Western Church declares that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, Filioque. And it became this real lightning rod of contention. Now, why is it so important? Why did it matter so much to them from whom the Holy Spirit proceeds? If it's the Father and the Son, isn't it both, that there's some truth in both of them? Well, yes, but there's another issue that's going on behind the scenes, and it is a theological issue. So, quick snapshot. The way that the Eastern Church, the Greek-speaking church at the time, approached God was very much as a God who is three and yet one. So the threeness of God was primary and the oneness of God was subsequent. The Western Church, predominantly influenced by the theology of Augustine, approached God as one who was subsequently three. So the oneness of God was the dominant theology and the threeness of God was that which came after. So they really approached God in two slightly different ways. One, the Eastern Church was much more relational because the personhoods of God, Father, Son and Holy Spirit, was the primary way that we meet God. In the Western Church, it was the transcendence, the ontology of God being eternal and other. The oneness, the difference that God is to us is the primary factor, and then the threeness of God, the Father, Son and the Spirit, being made known essentially in the Son, the incarnation, that becomes then the way that we speak of God. So there's these different approaches, and into that there's this different idea of how we speak of God, relate to God, worship God. And so the procession of the Holy Spirit from God is actually a really important theological issue that we don't have time to go into all the metaphysics of right now. But enough to say that the Eastern Church and the Western Church felt very strongly that the Eastern Church, the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. Western Church, the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. It gets to the point where they disagree so vehemently that they actually excommunicate each other at specially called meetings to say you're no longer orthodox, and then they said, well, actually we think you're no longer orthodox, and so they would, excommunicate each other. Fortunately, there were a couple of reconciling meetings around about the 11 and 1200s where they were able to forge a theology that they could both sort of reluctantly agree on as a middle ground, but it never really stuck or took much traction, but actually theologically they did some great work. The point of the whole Filioque lesson for us, though, is that if we become too dogmatic about things that are beyond our understanding, if we try and assert our faith beyond that which is really, which we're really able to thoroughly grasp, then it goes from being a constructive dialogue to being a destructive interaction. And the Filioque story is exactly that. We're dealing with beautiful theology. We're dealing with the very essence of God's life, the inner life of God, the Holy Spirit, the Son and the Father together making themselves known to us beautifully and generously, and yet that actually becomes a weapon that's used within the church to fight off other factions that we think are dangerous or unorthodox. And so it gives us pause to consider the things that we believe. Yes, we hold strongly to them and we value them, but not at the detriment of the relationship and the love that God has asked us to live in and to demonstrate and share with each other. Because the Holy Spirit, the fruit of the Holy Spirit, the first fruit of the Holy Spirit is love. And so the tragic irony of this story from history is that it brought out anything but love amongst the church and the church leaders. And so there's a sobering warning for all of us within that. As we read John chapter 14, it really clarifies things for us in a way where Jesus says, I will ask the Father and He will send the Spirit. So the Father does send the Spirit on behalf of the Son. Later on in John 14, Jesus says, the Father will send the Spirit in my name. And so there is this sort of agreement, this Trinitarian self-giving, that the Father gives the Spirit in the name of the Son. Then Jesus says right after that, again in John 14, he says, I will leave you, and yet I will then come to you, speaking of the Holy Spirit. So he identifies himself with and in and through the Holy Spirit. So as we look back at the history of the doctrine of the Trinity, there's so much to learn on the good, but there's also a few warning points for us to learn on some of the negative experiences of the church, and to embrace a biblical theology of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Bless you.